Deep within the jungles of Central America stand silent stone cities. For centuries, the Maya civilization thrived here, building vast networks of metropolises under a canopy of green. Their pyramids reached for the stars, and their kings claimed to speak with the gods. Then, something went terribly wrong. By the end of this story, you will understand the complex tapestry of events that led to one of history's greatest disappearances, piecing together clues from climate science and ancient ruins. We will explore why mighty kingdoms were abandoned to the vines and how a series of droughts could have shattered a world. What does it feel like to watch your entire civilization slowly fade away? Their world was a vibrant tapestry of city-states, each a powerful kingdom in its own right. From roughly 250 to 900 AD, the Maya civilization flourished in what scholars call its classic period. This was their golden age. Great cities like Tikal rose from the jungle floor, its limestone temples piercing the sky. At its heart stood the Grand Plaza, surrounded by pyramids where rulers performed sacred rituals for crowds of thousands below. Not far away, the city of Palenque was a masterpiece of art and architecture, with elegant palaces and intricate stone carvings depicting its divine kings. These were not isolated outposts but part of a vast, interconnected network of millions of people. Their intellectual achievements were staggering. Maya scribes developed the most sophisticated writing system in the Americas, a complex blend of glyphs that recorded history, mythology, and royal lineages. They were mathematical geniuses, among the first people in the world to conceptualize the number zero, a revolutionary idea that allowed for complex calculations. Their astronomers tracked the movements of Venus and Mars with breathtaking accuracy, creating calendars so precise they could predict eclipses centuries in advance. One of their calendars, the Long Count, measured time in cycles that stretched over thousands of years. Imagine the confidence of a society that could map the heavens and chart the passage of millennia. This was a world of bustling marketplaces, of artisans crafting fine jade and colorful textiles, of farmers who cultivated the land to support these thriving urban centers. It was a complex, dynamic, and utterly brilliant society, a civilization truly at its peak. To understand the depth of their collapse, you must first appreciate the magnificent height from which they fell. Yet this golden age did not last forever. The first signs of trouble are not written in grand tales of catastrophe, but in quiet omissions. Archaeologists sifting through the ruins noticed a profound silence beginning in the 8th and 9th centuries. In city after city, the practice of erecting carved stone monuments known as stelae simply stopped. These towering slabs were the official records of the Maya world, commissioned by kings to proclaim their military victories, their divine right to rule, and their sacred ceremonies. Their sudden absence is like a history book with the final chapters torn out. At the same time, the ambitious construction of new pyramids and palaces slowed to a halt. Projects were left unfinished, as if the workers just walked away one day and never returned. You can stand in a plaza today and see a half-completed temple, a monument to a future that never arrived. Even the way they buried their dead began to change. In the peak of the classic period, Maya rulers were interred with incredible wealth, surrounded by jade masks, finely painted pottery, and offerings that reflected their immense power. But as time wore on, these elite burials became less lavish. The grave goods were simpler, the ceremonies perhaps more rushed. This subtle shift hints at a society where the ruling class was losing its grip, where the resources and will to maintain such extravagant displays of status were fading. It suggests a creeping instability, a fraying of the political and social fabric that had held the city-states together. The whispers from the jungle tell us the collapse was not a single event, but a slow unraveling, a silence that grew louder with each passing year. This growing silence in the stone records coincides with a discovery made far from the jungle temples. scientists drilling into the beds of ancient lakes have uncovered a stark environmental truth. The analysis of layered mud, known as sediment cores, acts like a climate time capsule. Within these layers, the preserved shells of tiny organisms and the chemistry of the mud itself reveal a history of rainfall. What they show is a devastating pattern. Starting around the 9th century, the region was struck by a series of extreme droughts, some lasting for decades. These were not merely dry seasons, they were profound, multi-generational shifts in climate that would have pushed a sophisticated society to its absolute limits. The evidence is corroborated deep within caves, where stalagmites rise from the floor like stone icicles. These formations grow incrementally, layer by layer, over centuries. The precise chemical composition of each layer, specifically the ratio of different types of oxygen atoms, is a direct proxy for rainfall at the time that layer was formed. Reading these stone pillars is like reading a millennia-old rainfall chart, and the message is terrifyingly clear. The charts show sharp, sustained drops in precipitation, perfectly aligning with the period when Maya cities were being abandoned. Think of the immense pressure this would place on a civilization. The Maya depended entirely on seasonal rains to fill their reservoirs and to water their crops of maize, beans, and squash. Their entire agricultural cycle, which supported millions of people, was a delicate balance. A single bad year could be managed, but what happens when the rains fail not for 1 year but for 20? Reservoirs would have evaporated, turning into cracked, dry basins. Crops would have withered in the fields long before they could be harvested. The result would have been an inevitability as grim as it is universal: widespread famine and unimaginable suffering. A society can withstand war and political turmoil, but it cannot survive without water. The very lifeblood of the civilization was slowly draining away. Yet the climate did not act alone. The Maya were not simply passive victims of a changing world, they were active participants in shaping their own fate. Their very success may have sown the seeds of their eventual crisis. To support those magnificent, populous cities, the Maya transformed the land around them on a massive scale. Vast tracts of jungle were cleared for agriculture, creating a landscape of fields and terraces. This deforestation, while necessary for feeding millions, would have had a profound and unintended consequence. The trees of the jungle are not just scenery, they are a vital part of the regional water cycle. Their leaves release moisture into the air, and their roots help the soil absorb rainfall. When the forests were cut down, this natural recycling system was broken. Scientists theorize that widespread clearing could have actually reduced local rainfall, making an already drying climate even worse. It is a tragic irony. Their drive to cultivate more land may have diminished the very rains their crops depended on. This environmental pressure was compounded by the sheer density of their population. In the hub of a city like Tikal, thousands of people lived closely together, placing immense strain on local resources. The land was farmed intensively, season after season, and without careful management, the fertile soil would have become exhausted, stripped of its nutrients. Evidence suggests that soil erosion became a significant problem, with precious topsoil washing away from overworked hillsides during heavy storms. This left the land less productive, just when a reliable food supply was most critical. Think of a family relying on a single well. For generations, the well provides. The family grows and they draw more and more water until one day the well begins to run dry. They are not malicious, they are just trying to survive, but their collective need has outstripped the resource. The Maya, in their golden age, were likely drawing down their own environmental reserves, creating a society that was increasingly fragile, a civilization living on the edge of its ecological means. When the great droughts finally arrived, they were not hitting a resilient system, they were striking one that was already deeply stressed. Into this world of environmental strain came the sound of clashing stone and the cries of war. The great Maya cities, once bound by trade and shared culture, began to turn on one another. Archaeologists find the scars of this conflict etched into the landscape itself. What were once open, sprawling ceremonial centers became fortified strongholds. At sites like Tikal and Palenque, massive defensive walls were constructed in a hurry, often using stones ripped from existing monuments and palaces. These were not planned additions but desperate measures, a clear sign that the greatest threat was no longer just a distant enemy but a neighbor. The artistic record tells an even more vivid story. Murals and carved stone panels, which once glorified royal births and celestial events, increasingly depicted scenes of conquest and humiliation. We see captured rulers on their knees, their arms bound as victorious kings stand over them. In the city of Palenque, a famous series of murals shows a chaotic and brutal battle in progress, warriors clashing on temple steps with captives awaiting a grim fate. These are not just boasts of power, they are testaments to a world descending into chronic violence. This warfare was devastatingly personal. Mass graves have been uncovered at the bases of these walls, containing the jumbled skeletons of men, women, and children, some bearing the marks of weapon injuries. These were not ceremonial burials, but the hasty disposal of a community struck by catastrophe, likely a successful siege that ended in slaughter. The political fabric that had held the civilization together was tearing apart. The divine kings who had promised to bring rain and prosperity through their connection to the gods were now failing. When the rains did not come and crops withered, their spiritual authority crumbled. Rival factions and noble families likely battled for control of dwindling resources, fragmenting kingdoms from within. A society that could no longer cooperate could not possibly marshal a unified response to a crisis as vast as a multi-decade drought. How do you organize a massive project to dig new wells or build new reservoirs when your cities are at war? The very cooperation needed for survival had been replaced by suspicion and conflict. The sound of clashing cities was the sound of a civilization breaking its own backbone. What happens when a king who claims to command the rain stands before his people under a cloudless, burning sky? The authority of a Maya ruler was not merely political, it was cosmic. These kings were the vital link between the human world and the divine, responsible for performing the rituals that ensured the sun would rise, the rains would fall, and the world would remain in balance. Their power was built upon a sacred contract with their people. In return for their leadership, the populace provided the labor to build their towering pyramids and the faith that sustained their rule. But this contract had one non-negotiable condition: it required results. For generations the system worked. Kings would ascend temple pyramids, perform bloodletting ceremonies, and call upon the gods, and the seasonal rains would typically arrive. Their success was etched into the stone stelae that proclaimed their glory. Then the droughts began. Year after year, the reservoirs shrank. The maize in the fields grew stunted and brown. The king would have performed the same rituals with even greater fervor, but the skies remained a relentless, empty blue. How long can you maintain faith in a leader who promises life but delivers only dust? The failure was not just agricultural, it was spiritual. The very foundation of their society was cracking. If the king could no longer speak to the gods, then what was he but a man who had failed to protect his people? This crisis of faith would have rippled through every level of society. The nobles who supported the king's court would have grown restless, their loyalty wavering as their own stores of food dwindled. The farmers and laborers who formed the backbone of the civilization would have lost the motivation to contribute to grand projects. Why haul stones for a new temple when your children are hungry and the king you are building it for appears to have been abandoned by the heavens? The social glue that held the city-state together was dissolving. In this vacuum of authority, alternatives would have emerged. Ambitious warlords might have promised security through strength, while village elders may have retreated to local, traditional practices, bypassing the discredited royal court entirely. The centralized state with the divine king at its apex was becoming irrelevant. People did not necessarily abandon their cities all at once, but they began to abandon the idea that their rulers could save them. They turned inward to their families and their immediate survival. The great social machine that built the pyramids and sustained millions of people simply ground to a halt, not with a bang, but with a slow, heartbreaking whisper of lost hope. The intricate web of trade that connected the Maya world was its lifeblood, stretching from the volcanic highlands to the dense lowlands and along the Caribbean coast. A constant flow of goods moved along well-established routes. From the highlands came obsidian, the sharp, black volcanic glass essential for crafting tools and weapons. From the coasts came salt, a fundamental necessity for preserving food and sustaining life. The fertile lowlands produced vast quantities of maize and the precious cacao beans, which were not only a culinary delight but also a form of currency. And from specialized quarries came the brilliant green jade, carved into sacred symbols of power and status for the elite. This was more than just commerce, it was a complex economic system that bound distant cities together in a web of mutual dependence. A king in a lowland city like Tikal relied on highland obsidian to equip his warriors, while a highland merchant depended on lowland maize to feed his family. The entire civilization was interconnected. When warfare between city-states intensified and the environment began to fail, this vital network began to fray. Traveling merchants, once protected by royal decree, would have found their routes increasingly dangerous, threatened by bandits or rival armies. A trade caravan carrying jade and salt was no longer just a business venture, it was a target. At the same time, the cities that once produced surplus goods for export were now struggling to feed their own populations. Why send your precious salt to a neighboring kingdom when your own people are starving? Why risk a long journey for obsidian when your farmers need every able body to tend failing crops? One by one, the links in this economic chain snapped. The flow of goods slowed to a trickle and then stopped entirely. Imagine a modern city where the trucks stop delivering food, where the power grid fails, and where money loses its value. The result is societal collapse. For the Maya, the silencing of commerce meant that a city could no longer acquire the tools it needed to farm, the salt it needed to survive, or the luxury items that reinforced the social order. The economy did not just shrink, it shattered. The marketplace, once a bustling hub of social and economic life, fell silent, and with it, one of the last pillars holding up the Maya world crumbled into dust. The grand narrative of collapse can feel distant, but its true weight is measured in the fate of a single city. In the lush valley of Capon, the story of the Maya downfall becomes heartbreakingly personal. This city, renowned for its exquisite sculptures and its royal dynasty that lasted for 16 generations, experienced a stunningly rapid rise. Its population swelled, pushing the limits of the surrounding farmland. The very success of its kings in attracting people to their capital may have been its undoing. Archaeologists studying the skeletons buried in Capon's soil have found a silent, grim testimony to its final days. The bones, particularly those of children, show clear signs of chronic malnutrition and episodes of severe illness. Lines of arrested growth, etched into the teeth and bones, tell of repeated famines, of tiny bodies struggling to survive in a world where food was never quite enough. These are not just statistics, they are the scars of individual lives, of a generation that grew up hungry. The city's final king is a figure shrouded in a poignant silence. The last royal monument ever erected at Capon bears his name, but it was never finished. The carving is rough, the details incomplete, as if the artisans were forced to flee before their work was done. Soon after, the great ceremonial plaza fell quiet. The royal palace stood empty. The people of Capon did not vanish in a single day, but over a generation or two, families made the difficult choice to leave. They walked away from their ancestral homes, dispersing into the smaller, more sustainable villages in the surrounding hills. the magnificent city, once a beacon of art and power, was slowly reclaimed by the roots and the vine. Its story is a microcosm of the wider collapse, a reminder that this historical event was, at its core, a multitude of personal tragedies, a slow exodus of hope from a place that could no longer sustain the dreams of its people. Even the mightiest of kingdoms could not hold back the encroaching silence. Tikal, the very heart of the Maya world, stood as a testament to this truth. For centuries, its rulers had commanded armies and commissioned pyramids that scraped the sky, their power echoing through the jungle. But the stone record here tells a story of a slow, inexorable fade. The last great monument erected in the city's main plaza was raised around the year 869. After that, the carvers put down their tools for good. The stele that once chronicled the triumphs and rituals of each new king simply ceased. The royal lineage, a dynasty that had guided Tikal for over 500 years, appears to have ended not with a war or a dramatic overthrow, but with a quiet, unanswered question. There is no grand tomb for a final ruler, no monument to mark a succession. The throne itself was left empty. This political vacuum was mirrored by a physical emptying of the city. At its peak, Tikal's urban core and surrounding farmlands may have supported a population of 100,000 people or more. Its central plazas would have thrummed with the energy of countless souls. Yet, as the 9th century wore on, that energy dissipated. Archaeologists find that the great palaces and residential compounds surrounding the ceremonial center were gradually abandoned. The evidence lies in the quiet details: a cooking pot left behind, a floor that gathered dust, a doorway that was deliberately sealed as a family took their possessions and moved on. This was not a sudden, panicked flight, but a protracted departure, a community slowly dispersing. The people did not vanish from the earth, they simply left the city, likely retreating to smaller, more manageable villages where the pressure on resources was less intense. The urban experiment, with all its grandeur and its immense logistical demands, was no longer sustainable. The jungle, patient and relentless, began its work. Vines crept over the stairways of the grand pyramid known as Temple 1. Tree roots slowly pried apart the stone blocks of the Acropolis. The great causeways that connected the city's districts were reclaimed by the undergrowth. What had been a metropolis of unparalleled power became, over generations, a collection of silent, moss-covered structures. Tikal's story is a powerful lesson in fragility. It demonstrates that no amount of past glory could inoculate a city against the converging pressures of environmental stress, political failure, and social disintegration. The collapse was a great unraveling, and it reached even the most powerful thread in the Maya tapestry. There was no single day when the lights went out across the Maya world. The downfall was a slow, creeping shadow, a process of unraveling that stretched across more than 100 years. While we often imagine a civilization collapsing like a tower falling, the Maya experience was more like a tapestry slowly fraying at the edges, with threads snapping one by one until the entire picture was lost. This long timeline is one of the most crucial clues, and it completely upends the idea of a lone, catastrophic cause. A single invasion, a sudden plague, or a lone earthquake could not explain a decline that unfolded over 4 or 5 generations. Different city-states faltered at wildly different times and for their own complex reasons. Copan, for instance, entered its final decline in the early 9th century, while cities in the northern Yucatan, like Chichen Itza, were actually rising to prominence, experiencing a new cultural fluorescence even as their southern cousins were being swallowed by the jungle. This regional variation tells us that the collapse was not a uniform wave of destruction sweeping across the land. It was a mosaic of local crises, a series of individual failures where the unique pressures on each city, its specific environmental challenges, the choices of its leaders, its relationships with neighbors, finally became too much to bear. A city reliant on a single, failing reservoir would succumb to drought faster than one with multiple water sources. A kingdom torn apart by a bitter civil war would be more vulnerable than one that maintained internal unity. The collapse was not an event you could mark on a calendar. It was an era, a long, painful period of transformation where the old order of divine kings and grand cities gradually ceased to make sense. The true mystery is not what struck them down in a single blow, but why, over so many decades, they could not find a way to build themselves back up. While the great southern cities were falling into silence, a different story was unfolding in the north. The limestone plains of the Yucatan Peninsula became a refuge, a stage for a remarkable and prolonged cultural act. Cities like Chichen Itza and Uxmal did not just survive the turmoil of the 9th century, they thrived, entering a new age of splendor while their southern cousins were swallowed by the jungle. This northern resilience stands as a powerful counterpoint to the narrative of total collapse, forcing us to ask what they did differently. The answer appears to lie in a combination of geography, ingenuity, and a radical shift in political thinking. Unlike the southern lowlands, which relied on seasonal rivers and rainfall, the northern Yucatan is a flat, porous slab of limestone. Surface water is almost non-existent, as rain instantly drains through the rock into a vast underground network of rivers and caves. This seemingly hostile environment held a secret key to survival: the cenotes. These are natural sinkholes, collapsed sections of the limestone crust that expose the crystal-clear groundwater below. For the northern Maya, these were not just water sources, they were sacred wells, the very portals to the underworld. Chichen Itza, whose name means at the mouth of the well of the Itza, was literally built around two massive cenotes. One was used for everyday water supply, a practical and endless reservoir even during the worst droughts. The other was a sacred cenote, a place of ritual offerings to the rain gods. This guaranteed access to water provided a stability that the South could only dream of. Their survival was not just about finding water, but about storing it with breathtaking ambition. At the city of Uxmal, archaeologists have uncovered vast, complex systems of underground cisterns, known as choltuns, designed to capture and hold every precious drop of rainwater. The entire urban landscape was engineered for water management, with plazas sloped to channel runoff into these hidden reservoirs. This relentless focus on securing their most vital resource gave the northern cities a critical buffer against the climate shocks that crippled the South. But their adaptation went beyond engineering. The political and social structure of the North seemed to evolve. While the Southern model was centered on a single, all-powerful divine king, the North may have moved toward a more collective form of governance, something scholars call a multiple or shared rule. The art and architecture at Chichen Itza, for instance, to emphasize the cult of a single individual ruler. Instead of countless stelae glorifying one king, we see grand processions of warriors, priests, and officials depicted as equals. The famous Temple of the Warriors is flanked by rows of carved columns, each representing a different, seemingly co-equal leader. This shift away from a fragile, personality-dependent monarchy towards a council-based system could have provided greater stability. If one leader failed, the system could endure. It was a society that may have learned to distribute power, making it less vulnerable to the single point of failure that brought down the southern kings. The flourishing of the North was a testament to human adaptability. They looked at a harsher landscape and saw not limitation but opportunity. They built their resilience not on the promises of kings, but on the bedrock of practical innovation and perhaps a wiser, more shared form of power. Their prolonged survival whispers a tantalizing question: what if the southern cities had been able to change their ways before it was too late? While the northern cities demonstrated remarkable resilience, another silent killer may have been stalking the crowded plazas of the southern lowlands. We must consider the role of disease. The Maya were not an isolated people. Their vast trade networks connected them to other cultures across Mesoamerica, and those routes that carried salt and obsidian could have also carried invisible passengers, pathogens for which the Maya had no natural immunity. Imagine a merchant unknowingly carrying a new sickness arriving in a bustling city like Tikal. In a metropolis of thousands where people lived in close quarters and shared central water sources, an introduced virus or bacteria could spread with terrifying speed. Such an epidemic would not need to be a continent-spanning plague to be devastating. Even a localized outbreak of a novel disease like influenza or hemorrhagic fever could have catastrophic consequences. It would strike down farmers, weakening the labor force needed to tend crops. It would kill artisans and scribes, eroding the culture's knowledge base. It could even decimate the political and religious elite, creating a sudden and chaotic power vacuum at the very moment strong leadership was most needed. A society reeling from a disease crisis is a fragile one. Its people are weakened, its social structures are strained, and its capacity to respond to other threats is severely diminished. How do you organize a labor force to dig a new reservoir when a quarter of your population is sick or dying? How does a king command authority from his sick? A major epidemic would have acted as a devastating multiplier of all the other crises. It would have made a population far more vulnerable to the effects of famine brought on by drought. It would have shattered community morale, making people less likely to cooperate and more likely to flee. The skeletal evidence from some sites does show periods of poor health and physiological stress, though directly linking this to a specific pathogen remains difficult for archaeologists. Yet the possibility is haunting. The very interconnectedness that made the Maya civilization great, its far-reaching trade, may have ultimately delivered a final, invisible blow to its heart. A city struggling with war and drought might have found a way to endure, but a city grappling with all that while also being ravaged by disease would have been pushed beyond its breaking point. This unseen enemy would have stolen not just lives, but the very strength and will needed to fight back against the encroaching darkness. The true measure of this collapse is found not in the silent palaces, but in the quiet desperation of a farmer standing in his field. For generations, his family had worked this same plot of land, reading the seasons and trusting in the rhythms of rain, but now the rhythm was broken. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the earth beneath his feet was cracked and hard. The maize stalks were stunted, their leaves curling inward from thirst. He knew with a sinking certainty that this harvest would not be enough. The hunger was no longer a distant threat, it was a constant, hollow presence in his home. He could see it in his children's eyes, in the way they grew listless and thin. The once reliable reservoir near the village was now just a muddy pit, and the long walk to the nearest cenote was a journey fraught with danger. Rumors of raiding parties and war bands made every path feel like a trap. The sound of a distant conch shell, once a call to ceremony, now sent a jolt of fear through the community. Was it a warning? Were soldiers coming? In the city, an artisan who once carved beautiful jade pendants for the nobility now found her skills useless. The flow of precious stone had stopped with the caravans, and no one had the wealth or the will to commission such luxuries anymore. Her hands, trained for delicate work, were now calloused from hauling water and scrounging for firewood. The grand marketplace, where she used to trade her wares for salt and cloth, was a shadow of its former self. A few desperate people haggled over scraps, their voices hushed and tense. The air, once thick with the smells of roasting maize and copal incense, now carried the faint, unsettling odor of decay. Every day was a calculation of risk. Do you venture farther into the failing forest to hunt, knowing you might encounter an enemy scout? Do you trust the neighbor who now looks at your family's meager food stores with a little too much interest? The social trust that had glued the community together was dissolving, replaced by a weary suspicion. The psychological toll was perhaps the heaviest burden. They lived with the slow motion unraveling of their entire world. They watched their kings, those supposed intermediaries with the gods, become increasingly frantic and then simply fade away, their power as illusory as the missing rain. They saw the temples where they had prayed and celebrated stand empty, their stones beginning to crumble. The stories their grandparents told of a golden age of abundance and power must have felt like cruel fables. What do you tell your children when the gods no longer answer and the future has been cancelled? For the common person, the collapse was not a historical event. It was a daily erosion of security, of hope, and of meaning. It was the crushing weight of watching everything you knew and relied upon slowly, inexorably fall apart. The final stone messages from the Maya kings are not grand pronouncements of doom, but something far more revealing. In the last dated inscription ever carved at Tikal from the year 869, the text records a routine event known as an ending of a K adjective, a tun, a 20-year cycle in their long count calendar. It describes rituals performed by the ruler, his attendance by other nobles, and the celebration of the period's completion. There is no mention of war, famine, or dying gods. The words are formal, traditional, and utterly focused on maintaining the cosmic order, as if by performing the correct ceremonies, the king could force the world to remain as it was. This is the profound and heartbreaking pattern found across the southern lowlands. The very last monuments are almost exclusively concerned with this kind of calendrical ritual, the marking of time itself. It is as if, faced with a reality that was crumbling around them, the ruling class retreated into the one thing they could still control, the perfect, predictable mathematics of their calendars. They were not documenting the collapse, they were trying to ritually prevent it, clinging to the ceremonies that had always worked in the past. In the city of Karakol, one of the final stelae shows a king standing over two bound captives, a classic image of military triumph. Yet the accompanying text makes no grand claims of new conquests or expanded territory. It is a retrospective looking back to a victory from decades earlier. The message seems to be one of nostalgia, an attempt to invoke the ghost of past glories when present realities were so bleak. The scribes were not writing a new history, they were curating an old one, reminding their people of a time when kings were truly powerful. What does this tell us about their understanding of the crisis? They did not see it as the end of their world, at least not in these final official records. They saw it as a temporary imbalance, a breach in the sacred contract that could be mended with enough faith and the correct ritual performance. Their concern was not with adapting to a new, harsher reality, but with restoring the old one. The worldview etched into these last stones is one of profound tradition, a belief that the solutions of the past would be sufficient for the troubles of the present. The silence that follows these final glyphs is all the more powerful because of what they do not say. There are no records of surrender, no admission of failure, no chronicle of a people's exodus. The story simply stops mid-sentence, in the middle of a ritual that was supposed to ensure another 20 years of prosperity. The last words of the Maya classic period are not a scream, but a whisper of faith in a system that had already ceased to function. The world after the collapse was profoundly different, a landscape of ghosts and survivors. The great southern cities stood completely empty, their grand plazas silent except for the rustle of leaves and the calls of howler monkeys. The pyramids of Tikal and Palenque became mere landmarks in a reclaimed wilderness, their stone faces gradually wearing smooth under centuries of rain. The political and cultural heart of the Maya world had shifted irrevocably to the north, to places like Chichen Itza, but even there the nature of power had changed. The era of the all-powerful divine king who claimed a direct line to the gods was largely over. In its place emerged smaller, more pragmatic centers of authority, often ruled by councils of elites or merchant lineages. This was not a complete disappearance of Maya civilization, but a dramatic and painful transformation. The population did not vanish, it dispersed. Millions of people had once lived in the bustling lowland cities. Now their descendants lived in smaller, scattered villages, often far from the old ceremonial centers. They continued to speak their languages, to worship adapted versions of their gods, and to pass down their stories, but they did so in a world that no longer had room for the grand ambitions of their ancestors. The cultural flame was not extinguished, but its intensity was dialed down. The elaborate artistic styles, the complex writing system used for royal proclamations, the tradition of erecting stone stelae, these hallmarks of the classic period faded from common use. Life became more local, more focused on survival and community than on imperial glory. This new world, which scholars call the post-classic period, was a quieter, more fragmented one. It was a civilization learning to live with the memory of its own magnificent failure, finding ways to endure in the long shadow of the empty cities. Centuries after the southern cities fell silent, a new and different kind of storm gathered off the coast. In the early 1500s, Spanish ships arrived on the shores of the Yucatan Peninsula. For the descendants of the classic Maya, living in their smaller, post-collapse states, this was not a slow unraveling but a sudden, violent impact. The world that had already transformed once was now facing a second, even more devastating collision. The Spanish conquistadors brought with them steel, horses, and a relentless drive for conquest and conversion, forces that the fractured Maya kingdoms were ill-equipped to withstand. One by one, their remaining centers of power were subjugated. The final independent Maya stronghold, the island city of Tayezal, held out until 1697, a remarkable testament to their enduring spirit, but it too eventually fell. This military conquest was catastrophic, but an unseen weapon proved even more deadly. The Spanish and the waves of settlers and missionaries who followed unintentionally unleashed a biological apocalypse upon the Americas. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which the native populations had no immunity, swept through communities with a horrifying speed that drought and warfare never could. These were illnesses that could wipe out entire villages in a matter of weeks. The societal devastation was absolute. The intricate knowledge held by priests and scribes, the last vestiges of the old ways, was lost as the elders who carried it perished. Families were shattered, and the social structures that had endured through the post-classic period were broken. Within a century of contact, it is estimated that up to 90% of the indigenous population in some regions had perished from disease and violence. This was more than a military defeat. It was a demographic catastrophe that nearly erased a people and their history. The Spanish conquest layered a new, profound tragedy over the ancient one. The first collapse was a failure of environment and political systems, a story of a civilization turning inward on itself. The second was an external assault, a deliberate dismantling of a culture and a near-total annihilation of its people. The long history of the Maya became a story of two great endings, separated by centuries, but together weaving a tapestry of almost unimaginable loss. The echoes of the Maya collapse ripple far beyond their silent stone cities, speaking directly to the vulnerabilities of our own world. Their story is not a relic of a distant past, but a stark mirror reflecting modern challenges we face on a global scale. Consider their struggle with water. The Maya depended on predictable seasonal rains, and when those rains failed for decades, their society fractured. Today, we see similar patterns, with climate change intensifying droughts in regions from the American West to the Horn of Africa, placing immense strain on reservoirs and agricultural systems. Our modern metropolises, supported by complex infrastructure, are just as dependent on a stable water supply as Tikal or Capon once were. The parallel is unsettling, a reminder that water security remains a fundamental pillar for any civilization. The Maya also transformed their landscape, clearing vast forests to feed a growing population. This deforestation likely reduced local rainfall, creating a feedback loop that worsened their drought. We are now witnessing a similar, though vastly larger, transformation of our planet. The clearing of the Amazon rainforest and other vital ecosystems is not just a loss of biodiversity. It is a direct intervention in the Earth's climate system, disrupting rainfall patterns and carbon cycles on a continental scale. The Maya example shows us that a society can actively undermine its own life support systems through the very actions it takes to sustain itself. Their grand cities were a testament to human ingenuity, yet that same ingenuity, when divorced from a deep understanding of environmental limits, paved the way for their decline. What does it mean when our own technological power to reshape the world outstrips our wisdom to manage the consequences? The Maya collapse underscores the fragility of complex societies. Their interconnected network of city-states, reliant on long-distance trade and a centralized political system, was a magnificent achievement. But when drought, war, and famine struck, that same complexity became a liability. The failure of one part of the system cascaded into others, leading to a general breakdown. Our globalized world is the ultimate complex system. A disruption in one region, whether a pandemic, a financial crash, or a crop failure, can send shockwaves around the planet in hours. The Maya could not see the systemic risks they were creating, but we have the advantage of hindsight and data. Their history is a cautionary tale about building resilience into our systems, about diversifying our resources, and about recognizing the invisible threads that bind our prosperity to the health of our environment. They are a whisper from the jungle, urging us to learn from their unraveling so that our own story might have a different ending. For centuries, the dense jungle canopy guarded its secrets well. Archaeologists on the ground could only piece together fragments of the Maya world, slowly mapping the grand pyramids that broke through the green veil. They knew they were missing something, that the true scale of this civilization was hidden just out of sight. Then, a technological miracle gave them the ability to see through the trees. It is called LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging. The concept is elegantly simple. A plane flies over the jungle, firing millions of laser pulses at the ground every second. These tiny beams of light penetrate the thickest leaves and vines, bouncing off the solid ground below. By measuring the precise time it takes for each pulse to return, a computer can construct an incredibly detailed, three-dimensional map of the Earth's surface, digitally stripping away the forest to reveal the human landscape beneath. The results have been nothing short of revolutionary. What appeared to our eyes as an unbroken wilderness was in fact a meticulously engineered world. The LiDAR maps reveal a staggering web of causeways connecting cities we never knew were neighbors. They show vast terraced farms sculpting entire hillsides and intricate networks of irrigation canals and reservoirs that managed water on an almost industrial scale. Most stunningly, they have uncovered the ghostly outlines of tens of thousands of previously unknown houses, palaces, and fortifications. This is not just a matter of finding a few new ruins, it is a complete recalibration of the Maya world. The population estimates for the classic period have skyrocketed. Where we once thought of cities like Tikal as isolated ceremonial centers, we now see them as the dense urban cores of sprawling metropolitan areas, supported by a countryside teeming with people. The civilization was far larger, more interconnected, and more complex than we ever dreamed. This new evidence forces us to rethink the collapse itself. The sheer density of population that LiDAR reveals makes the civilization's downfall even more profound. It was not a scattering of villages that emptied out, but a vast, densely populated landscape that underwent a catastrophic depopulation. The environmental pressures we discussed, the deforestation and soil exhaustion, would have been magnified exponentially across this newly revealed, heavily modified landscape. The scale of the warfare, hinted at by newly discovered defensive walls and fortresses, appears to have been far more widespread and intense. The collapse now looks less like the quiet end of a golden age and more like the dramatic failure of a highly advanced, heavily populated, and intensely interconnected society. LiDAR has not solved the mystery of the Maya collapse, it has made it deeper and more urgent. It shows us a civilization that pushed its environment to the absolute limit, building a world of astonishing achievement whose foundations we now understand were even more precarious than we knew. A great many people around the world held their breath as the calendar approached December 21st, 2012. According to a popular modern myth, the ancient Maya had predicted the world would end on that day. The truth, however, is far more fascinating and reveals a profound misunderstanding of their view of time. The Maya did not foresee an apocalypse in 2012. They were simply celebrating the completion of a grand cycle in their long count calendar. Think of their calendar not as a linear countdown to doom, but as a cosmic odometer. The long count measured vast stretches of time in cycles, much like our own centuries and millennia. The cycle that ended in 2012 was a period known as the 13th B adjective, a K adjective TUN, a span of roughly 5,125 years. For the Maya, the end of such a cycle was a moment of great spiritual significance, a time of renewal and rebirth, not destruction. It was the equivalent of New Year's Eve on a cosmic scale, a turning over of a great page in the book of time. The myth of an impending cataclysm was a modern invention, a piece of Hollywood fantasy mixed with millennial anxiety. The real Maya would have likely prepared for this date with ceremony and anticipation, looking forward to the dawn of a new era, not the end of all things. This misconception separates us from the true genius of their worldview. They saw time as a series of repeating, sacred cycles where the gods could be petitioned and the balance of the world maintained through ritual. Theirs was a philosophy of cyclical renewal, not finality. The silence of their cities today speaks not of a predicted end, but of a real historical decline that had nothing to do with celestial prophecies and everything to do with the hard realities of life on earth. The silence of the ancient cities can be deceiving. While the stone kingdoms of the classic period fell, the Maya people themselves never vanished. Millions of Maya live today across southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, speaking more than 30 distinct Mayan languages and maintaining vibrant, resilient cultures. For these communities, the ancient collapse is not a forgotten mystery but a profound part of their living history, a story passed down not in glyphs but in oral traditions and daily practices. Many contemporary Maya view the abandonment of the great cities not as a simple failure, but as a consequence of a broken covenant with the natural world. In their worldview, the land is sacred, and the ancient kings, in their ambition, may have neglected their duty to maintain balance. The cities fell because they became unsustainable, their rulers perhaps forgetting that human power is subordinate to the forces of nature. This perspective transforms the collapse from a mere historical event into a powerful moral lesson about hubris and responsibility. The preservation of this heritage is a conscious, ongoing act. In the highlands of Guatemala, Maya women still weave intricate patterns on backstrap looms, their vibrant huipil blouses carrying symbolic designs that speak of their community and cosmology, a direct link to the artistic genius of their ancestors. Elders continue to perform ceremonies at sacred caves and mountain shrines, honoring the same rain gods and earth lords that their forebears petitioned centuries ago. The Popol Vuh, the epic Mayan creation story, was preserved through the colonial period by scribes who transcribed it into the Latin alphabet, ensuring that the voices of the hero twins and the story of the maize god would not be silenced. Today, this living connection is a testament to incredible endurance. It is a reminder that the true measure of a civilization is not solely in its grandest monuments, but in the quiet persistence of its language, its stories, and its spiritual relationship with the world. The ancient cities stand as a lesson in stone, but the living Maya are the keepers of its meaning, ensuring that the echo of their past continues to inform their future. Despite the wealth of clues we have gathered, the full story of the Maya collapse remains tantalizingly out of reach, a historical puzzle with several crucial pieces still missing. We can map the droughts, trace the warfare, and see the political disintegration, but some fundamental questions continue to echo in the silent plazas. For instance, why did some powerful cities fall so completely while others, like Lamani in modern-day Belize, managed to persist for centuries, showing a continuity of life right through the collapse era and beyond? The environmental stresses and political conflicts were widespread, yet their impacts were strikingly local. This suggests that the resilience of a city was not just about its size or power, but about a unique combination of factors we are still trying to fully understand. Perhaps Lamani's location on a river provided a more reliable water source, or maybe its leaders made different, more pragmatic choices in the face of crisis. The variation in their fates deepens the mystery rather than solves it. Another enigma is the search for a final trigger. Was there a single, catastrophic event that pushed the strained civilization over the edge? A volcanic eruption could have spewed ash that blotted out the sun and crippled agriculture for years. Or perhaps a devastating pandemic, as we considered earlier, swept through the population already weakened by famine, delivering a final, shattering blow. The evidence for such a single, dramatic catalyst remains elusive, buried perhaps in lake sediments or hidden in the DNA of ancient bones. Without it, we are left with the haunting possibility that it was not one disaster, but the slow, cumulative weight of many that finally broke the system. And then there is the question of sequence. Did famine from the droughts lead to warfare, which then shattered political authority? Or did political collapse and civil war come first, making society too fragmented and weak to respond effectively when the climate crisis hit? Untangling this knot of cause and effect is like trying to determine which domino in a long line fell first, setting the entire chain in motion. The answers to these questions matter because they change the very nature of the story. Was the collapse an inevitable tragedy, or was it a preventable one? The silence of the stones holds its secrets tightly, reminding us that some histories are written not in clear text, but in fragments we must forever strive to piece together. No single theory can fully explain the silence that fell over the cities. The Maya collapse resists a simple story of invasion or catastrophe. Instead, the truth appears to lie in the terrifying power of convergence. Imagine a series of separate threads, each one a manageable problem on its own, suddenly weaving together into an unbreakable cord. A severe drought alone might have tested their resilience. Intense warfare by itself could have been survived. Even political failure or environmental strain might have been overcome with time and effort. But when all of these crises arrived at once, they created a feedback loop of destruction that was far greater than the sum of its parts. A multi-year drought would have caused crop failure, which led to famine. That famine would have weakened populations, making them more susceptible to disease. Desperate, hungry people would have lost faith in their rulers, who could no longer bring rain, shattering the political order. This political collapse made large-scale cooperation impossible, so no one could organize a regional response to dig new wells or manage remaining resources. As social trust evaporated, warfare between city-states intensified over what little food and water remained. This constant conflict further damaged the environment and made farming even more dangerous. Each problem amplified the next, creating a vicious cycle with no escape. A society can patch one hole in its hull, but when the entire structure springs leaks simultaneously, the vessel is doomed to sink. The Maya did not face a lone enemy, they faced a symphony of disasters, each one playing a different instrument of decline until the entire civilization was overwhelmed by the noise. Their story is a haunting lesson in systemic risk, showing how the very interconnectedness that makes a civilization great can also become the pathway for its complete and total unraveling. A deep, enduring quiet now rests where thousands once gathered. The humid air, thick with the scent of wet earth and blooming orchids, carries only the gentle rustle of leaves. High above the empty plazas, a troop of howler monkeys moves slowly through the canopy, their distant calls echoing not as a warning, but as a simple statement of presence. Vines cascade over the stone faces of forgotten kings, their intricate features worn smooth by centuries of rain. Tree roots, patient and powerful, have pried apart grand stairways, embracing the limestone blocks in a slow, green grip. Sunlight filters through the jungle roof, dappling the forest floor where colorful butterflies drift on unseen currents. This is not a silence of absence, but one of reclamation. The jungle was never conquered, only briefly held at bay. It waited, breathing just beyond the edges of the grand causeways and terraced farms, and now it has returned, not with violence, but with a profound and gentle persistence. The peace that hangs over these ruins is the peace of a world healing itself, of a balance restored after a long and turbulent dream. Listen to the whisper of the wind through the tall grasses that now carpet the great ball court. It is a lullaby for a civilization that has finally been allowed to rest. The story of the Maya is a deeply human one, a testament to both the heights of achievement and the fragility of even the greatest societies. Their world was not undone by a single cataclysm, but by a perfect storm of environmental pressure, political strife, and social fragmentation. It was a slow-motion unraveling where a series of interconnected crises amplified one another until the brilliant tapestry of their civilization frayed beyond repair. Yet their legacy is far from a simple tale of disappearance. It lives on in the millions of their descendants who preserve their languages and traditions, and in the profound lessons their history offers us about resilience, balance, and the intricate bond between a people and their environment. The silent cities now stand as monuments to the passage of time, their stones holding secrets we are still learning to decipher. As the jungle continues its gentle reclamation, it offers a final, soothing thought. History is not always a roar, sometimes it is a whisper, a quiet mystery that invites reflection rather than demands answers. May the echoes of this ancient world bring you a sense of calm, and may you drift into a peaceful sleep cradled by the quiet wisdom of the past.
Thank you.